Yellow jacket got me right in the head. He got into the attic space of the breezeway because the board shrunk. It had those horizontal boards on the gable end. It shrunk, so there's a gap in there, so they went in there and made a nest. So I need to get that nest out of there, and then I need to block that off before I board that up, so I don't want them finding another way to either get into the cabin or make a nest somewhere else in a cavity in there with a new entrance. I'm going to deal with that. But the bottom line is what I've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, or for the next 45 minutes, if I put this at the beginning of the video, is that essentially what I'm doing is increasing the carrying capacity of this land. And that is, I guess, what I'm saying is my passion is to create abundance where there's not as much prosperity and abundance. So my acreage here is pretty diverse. Got some pretty diverse landscape, topography, and then as a result, pretty diverse ecology, from these meadows to the forest, to pine forest, conifer forest, to the upland hardwood forests, and then marshes. So by maintaining that diversity and then improving on it by creating spaces, new spaces that are additionally fertile and have better sun exposure. So creating these pockets of abundance basically throughout the landscape here, and then planting species that would survive here and maybe a bit native to certain parts of this area, but not necessarily on this property. So I'm increasing the diversity of and abundance of food species for wildlife and for humans. So hopefully you're interested in seeing me do this habitat improvement and permaculture improvement of this property and the homestead. If so, then the next 40 minutes or so are going to be fairly interesting, I think. And if not, then just tune in next week and you'll see me finishing off this roof. You can see it's pretty well framed. I've got a couple hours left to finish the framing, then I'm going to build my cupola and then start hauling up the sheet metal sheets, which is going to be interesting. I'm not 100% sure how I'm doing that yet. What are you looking at? Everybody, welcome back to the cabin. I don't know if the lighting is going to be okay. The camera's fogging up because the humidity levels are so high. I'm kind of showing you though some of the markings on the trees. This is marked by John, the forestry consultant that I hired. So a lot of you commented on some chainsawing that you heard in the background in my last video. Well, that was John marking one of the trails, access trails. So what we're doing, or what he's doing, what I've hired him to do, is to basically walk the entire acreage and identify areas that need some maintenance, some timber management, including harvesting of trees for lumber and for firewood, things that I need to live here. So that requires trails to get the ATV back to each of these areas so that I can cut the trees down and drag them back to my mill site or back to here where I can cut them up for firewood. Now part of it, my focus is not just for harvesting, but for improving the woodlot, or improving the forest, for wildlife as well as future timber. One of the nice things, or one of the, I think, responsibilities I think I have, is to improve the land and leave it in better shape than I found it when I bought it. And that includes the health of the forest itself, the ability for it to hold wildlife or promote the health of wildlife, but also to improve the health of the forest itself, and like the trees and the lower canopy and the ground level plants. So as I wander around, you're going to see markings on the trees. So it puts an orange spray paint all around the tree so they can be viewed from all sides. So as I'm walking through the forest, if it's only on one side, it's hard to identify that. But he's also marked the trails throughout the forest that provide access basically to the entire property, but going to specific different zones where different methods of tree harvesting are required. For example, we've got a blue trail that he's marking right now. He's taking the chainsaw and just cutting some of the smaller stuff, cutting them down so that there's a clear path for the ATV to get through, and then making wildlife brush piles with the upper branches anything that's hardwood size, or hardwood of a size that I can use for firewood. He's setting aside in 4-foot sections. And then branch piles of things that I can, of the right size for me to mulch, or to chip, so that I have lots of wood chips for the garden, especially because I'm trying to build soil in the vegetable garden, and I'm finding, this is what, my 3rd year here, finding that I have to put a lot more energy, devote a lot more energy to actually improving that soil so I can continue to grow food. So that blue trail goes from the mill, where I'm moving the mill to. I've got it right here beside the cabin that you've seen, but I don't plan on keeping it there. I'm building a little shelter for firewood and for the ATV and snowmobile to get it out of the weather. But so just a little further back down the trail, where I used to have it, I'm moving it back to there, so I need to clear a spot. So all the trails kind of converge at that point. So that blue trail starts there and goes about 400 yards or 415 meters or something, I think I mapped it out as, back through the forest up to a section sort of halfway back through the property, to an area that's mostly mature aspen. What is it? Trembling aspen, I think. Yeah, quaking trembling aspen. So those trees are all dying now. They've reached maturity, the end of their lifespan. So there's a whole section there of these trees that are starting to rot from the inside and fall over. Now I'm going to keep some of those standing for wildlife, or like nesting cavities and bugs and stuff like that to live in, for woodpeckers to get their food in. But anything that's in good enough shape that I can cut it down for lumber before it just does deteriorate and fall over, I'm cutting those. So that's going to end up being essentially a clear cut there. And what that will do is allow sunlight to come in and hit the forest floor and all this new vegetation to grow up, and re-sprouting of all the trees to give them an opportunity to grow up. What's probably mainly going to happen, where the forest section is dominated by aspen, when I cut those trees down, I'll probably wait till they're dormant this fall or winter or next spring, is that the roots survive and they just start shooting up new shoots from all over that root. So you got this massive root system, and it is still able to acquire all those nutrients and put it into this new growth. So you get this really dense growth of new aspen shoots, and that is amazing wildlife food. So here I'll have moose, rabbit, hare, snowshoe hare, and deer will be feeding on that heavily for the first few years. And then once that gets up to maturity level and starts reproducing, then the bears and the grouse really focus in on the catkins, on the like flowers and seeds that those trees produce. But in another area there, plan on maybe half an acre of that clear cut, planting that with some clover and some other perennials, Jerusalem artichokes, and a few other things that the deer can start feeding on. This area is really rough. So the entire area, traditionally and typically better moose habitat, got a lot of these open marshes like this old dried up beaver pond I have in front of the cabin here, that it's successional, so you're starting to get trees growing up in that. That's prime moose habitat. So that's scattered everywhere through here. And then you have these bedrock outcroppings, so no soil, bedrock comes right to the surface. Then you have these little pockets of soil. You got these sandy areas here where it's mostly conifers, and then you can see it rise up, and then I get into more of the hardwoods. A little bit deeper soils, a little bit better for growing. So those clear cuts I'm talking about, which anywhere from say half to, I don't even know if I'll have any 2 acres, probably not, probably half to 1 acre maximum size. The soils will be a little bit deeper, a little less acidic for me to grow crops like that. That will bring the deer in so they can feed on that heavily, especially throughout the summer when the fawns are growing and the does are lactating and the bucks are putting on size and antler growth. So they can focus on that food source, and it's pretty it'll be pretty intensively attractive to the deer, because that harshness that I'm talking about around here means food is scarce, especially in the fall and the winter. if it's not a good, we do have quite a few oaks, and I'm trying to free those up, so we're identifying those oaks and then cutting the trees around them so that those healthy oaks can grow bigger in girth, wider, and produce more acorns. The problem with these mature forests, or as they mature to this point, they get very crowded and each tree gets weak, diseased, vulnerable to pests, and just don't grow optimally. And you'll see that throughout even this section around the cabin where we, like this balsam fir, looks not too bad, but it's, I can see there's rot down at the lower end of it, and I already had one fall over right here. The maples were either cut or back when there was a burn, or they were browsed down at ground level basically, and now you see them sprouting up multi-stem, and some of those stems are dying, which happens because they get shaded out and the whole tree becomes weak. So all this ingress points for fungi and other pests to get into it and rot the wood. So that's one of the problems, and the other is that crowding just means that every tree is just fighting for energy from the sun and from groundwater and nutrients from the soil, and none of them are healthy as a result. So that cluster right there, if I take out say half of those trees, then the remaining trees have more sunlight, more water and nutrients from the ground, so they get much bigger in girth much quicker and are much healthier to fend off pests. It's a big job, which is why I did hire the forest consultant, not only for his knowledge to fill in the gaps where I'm lacking, but also to take the first steps just to create those pathways throughout, and then I'll start going in there and I'll continue with the pathways. Like I said, he's retired, so he's not doesn't have much time to dedicate to it, and I'm not sure how long he'll continue to even be interested in doing that. So it's going to fall on me, but I'm focused on getting the homestead finished first before I move out into these further zones from 4 and 5 permaculture zones, away from the cabin, more into the wilderness settings. But I'm really passionate about that part, and I'm excited about it. So I'm kind of picking away at it as I can, going in with a chainsaw or a handsaw and getting these trails cut so that I can get back to access other parts of the property, the more difficult parts to access. And then I'm identifying the firewood too, and what I can start getting back and getting ready for winter. Piled up, split, and so on. So the wildlife part of this habitat management, so there's two aspects of the forest management. There's the improvement of the trees themselves, and then including diversity, so making sure that there's a healthy mix of different species of trees, but as well as vines and ground covers and so on. And then there's the wildlife habitat improvement. So most animals are edge animals. They like those edges where you get a transition from one vegetation type to another, so dense forest and then a clearing like this, or these pond edges or meadow edges, field edges. That really concentrates first of all the food types of the diversity in food species, so you get more of the berries and the nuts and things like that along those fringes, but also transition and cover so that the animals can travel freely, or have, in case of a grouse or a bird, say they can fly freely through that opening or whatever. So the more edge habitat I have, the better for wildlife and for a diversity of plant species. So these trails through the forest, a lot of them I'll try to make wide enough that the sunlight can actually reach the forest floor, so that I can grow berries and nuts. There's a lot of native hazelnuts, peaked hazelnuts throughout the forest, and I'll see them scattered bushes all throughout, but they're not producing any nuts because they don't receive enough sunlight and airflow. So by creating these pathways wide enough for the sun to get in, it's going to encourage faster growth and then reproduction, so more seeds, so hazelnuts, berries, and so on. But then I also have some different species that I'm introducing, or that I'm cultivating for more production. So hazelnuts, for example, I have some cultivated or more domesticated hazelnuts that I'll be planting along those pathways and in the edges of those wildlife clearings or food plots that I'm creating. I have mulberries, raspberries, blackberries, hardy kiwi vines, hawthorn, apples, other fruits, blueberries. So these are all the things I'm encouraging so that I can feed not just game animals for me to harvest for food, like grouse and rabbits and deer, moose and bear, but also for all the other birds and other wildlife that rely on seed crops, like berries, and mass crops like soft mass like berries and other fruits, and then hard mass like the acorns. I'm planting hickories and chestnuts and things that are typically growing a little further south than here, but we're starting to get a little bit warmer in this area, and some of those species might survive. So I'm going to see what I can do about adding those to this parts of this ecosystem near where humans are habitating, like I am right here in this section of the forest. Anyway, hope that explains what I'm doing, where a lot of my time has been focused. I know the focus should be just on getting the home itself complete and the vegetable garden, but some of these things takes a long time to grow a tree. I have these bare root chestnuts that I've started, and hazelnuts, hawthorns, and a few others that were just little saplings or sticks that arrived in the mail. Bare root, I've planted those either into pots or into the ground, but they're going to take, in some cases, 25 years to start producing nuts, or several years at least for fruit production. So I'm trying to get those into the ground and get them started as soon as possible. And there's some out here, oaks and stuff, willows and a few other species that I planted 2 years ago that are now getting established. So I need to get the permanent perennial type things in the ground as early as possible, so that by the time I'm finished everything else, or further along with everything else here, those are starting to produce food for me and for the wildlife. So that's why I'm distracted. I'm all over the place and mostly working alone, other than this little bit of help from John and some help in the main vegetable garden for my family. Everything else is on me. This complete build is all on me. And, you know, this garden, the dream of the complete acreage being good for wildlife and humans. Mostly my idea, my passion, my dream. So this is a really good example of a brush pile for wildlife. So that tree, spruce tree, fell over. Did it rot first? Yeah, the base rotted. It fell over, probably in a little bit of wind, and now we're piling all the branches up against it. You have this solid cover, or solid log, a fairly solid log that's going to hold that debris off the ground. And by just packing more and more branches in there as we cut through this area, it's going to make that impenetrable for bigger animals, predators like coyotes and fox, and create all these little holes, tight spots that grouse and rabbits can get into, and squirrels and mice can get in there and escape the predators. So, talk about mice. I mean, don't like them around the cabin, but you certainly want them in your ecosystem because they're a bottom of the food chain species, so everything feeds on them. So the birds of prey, the pine martens and fisher, coyotes and foxes are feeding on these mice and red squirrels. We don't have black or gray squirrels here, but we do have quite a few red squirrels and chipmunks. So good wildlife cover. Got the piles of branches that are, under say 3.5 inches for mulching, for chipping, to create some biomass to put into the garden to start building soil there and retain the moisture in that sandy soil. And then we have firewood logs like these that are, it's almost all red maple, a few oaks that are inferior or poor quality or dying or dead already in this section. So red maple, birch, and oak primarily for firewood, softwood species for maybe some kindling, but mostly for chipping and for wildlife debris piles, cover piles, brush piles. So I'm going to continue through here. I'll show you where this heads to. So the plan is, showed that stake back there. It said 0% on the flagging tape, and with a center steel post there so it doesn't deteriorate before I get around to doing all of these clear cuts or these openings. And then he's marked 15 meters in diameter from that center post. So he marked the north, south, east, and west quadrants, perimeter. So what I'll do is, in that section, the 0% means I'm going to cut 0% of that forest, not going to touch anything essentially. See how that responds, or how that evolves over time compared to these different parcels. So basically 0% with a 30-meter diameter, and then 25% cut, and then a 50% cut, 75% cut, 100% cut. And like I mentioned, probably the 200% cut area is back at the end of this trail, which converges with a yellow trail. So the yellow and blue trail will have 200% cut, little clear cuts that are going to be 30 meters in diameter, which is not huge, but it's enough to allow the sunlight to get in. One of them will be a food plot, and one will be a regeneration plot where I'll just let the root sprouts and the stump sprouts come up and fill that space in. Plus the sunlight obviously hitting the floor is going to allow the herbaceous species to flourish as well, which would be primarily probably going to get, I would say, raspberries, blackberries, a number of other forbs. Probably, like I said, hazelnuts will get freed up. So we'll just keep an eye out over time. What I'll do is drone the cover now from above, so to show the closed canopy, how no sunlight's getting through to the forest floor. And then as I cut each section, I'll drone that again, show it from above, and also a view looking up at that canopy. And then show you over 5 or 10 years, 15, 20 years if I'm around and you're around, show you the evolution of each parcel of the forest and how the overall forest and ecosystem benefits from this work and how the wildlife respond. You're chasing squirrels, eh? Probably worth mentioning too that because each of these marked parcels are only 30 meters in diameter, it's that quarter of an acre each, and there's, we mark 4 on this side, 4 on the other side of the creek, so 8. So that's only, is that right? Only 2 acres total. That's the beginnings. It's 2 acres out of 100 and surrounded by thousands and thousands of uncut, and I think future uncut crown land, which is our public land here in Ontario, Canada. So very little cleared area compared to the overall size of this forest. So that's purposely like selecting a percentage of the forest to cut, but then throughout the rest I'll be selectively removing trees, again for use, firewood and lumber, but also for improving the health of the forest, so freeing up some of those good oak and pine trees for the future. So maybe they're got some timber value 20 to 50 years from now, but in the meantime, just become healthier, and the forest becomes healthier because they produce a lot of seed too for future generations. And every tree that I cut down allows the sunlight to hit the forest floor in that area, and the offspring start to grow up to replace those parent trees. There's a good example of what happens when a tree or two fall down. So the tops of a few of those bigger trees have died off. This is the beginning of that stand of poplars, aspens that are maturing, fully maturing and dying. So the canopies have died off and the sunlight's reaching the forest floor. Look how thick it is with green ferns and other forbs and saplings growing up, compared to what you see right behind us here, where there's hardly any green growing at the ground level. There's no sunlight's getting through, especially these balsam firs that are pretty thick. So I'm standing in the 75% plot, well, 75% tree canopy removal. So I think what we'll probably decide is that once all of these poplars come down, all these aspens, majority of them, leave a few for seed production for wildlife and for regeneration, but mostly the aspens and poplars regenerate from root sprouts. So as soon as I cut that tree down and use it, I'll cut these, whichever ones aren't rotted, I'll cut them into lumber, probably more like siding, because hemlock's not awesome for much else, other purposes like lumber purposes. But I'll make lumber, I think, out of it, boards, I mean, for siding, and make the shed and the barn, the mill building out of that, which is the lowest quality and lowest value lumber I have here. So anyway, probably majority of that'll come out, and then the odd maple for firewood. Some pretty good ones there that'll leave, the really healthy ones. So basically 25% of the trees will stay, and 75% will be removed. A lot of these balsam firs are really poor shape, poor condition, so they'll come down, and that's really going to allow the sunlight to hit the forest floor. So I think right here, this 75% section, this is south-facing slope too, so when we open up the canopy here, the sun's going to beat down in here and really regenerate this section of the forest. You're going to see a lot of growth. There is tons of saplings, small saplings in this section. So as we free those up, sunlight's going to hit them, and this will be a section I think they're just going to let naturally regenerate. So we'll see a huge succession of probably mostly these maples will win that battle, and if we see some, probably will find some oaks, oak saplings. We'll free those up maybe and allow those to dominate. Basically, successional forest in this area means that 100 years ago, when the fire went through, would have burned this mostly to the ground. You can see the stumps are charred from the cutting 150 years ago, the pine and hemlock and so on. It's all charred. So then the first things that would have grown up were the shade intolerant species like the birch and the aspen, some ironwood, some cherry and things like that. So that's what came up fast, created this canopy. And then the maples that are trying to grow in here, the red maples, are pretty shade intolerant too, so they grew up as well. But some of the later generations, more mature forest, had species like the oak and the white pine. That's what will probably replace this forest. So the next phase, next generation of trees here will be those more shade intolerant. What did I say before? So now the shade tolerant trees will start taking over, as because they've been sitting here waiting to grow. So again, some oak, some pine. I'm not sure, probably the odd sugar maple too start growing up here. So here we have the terminal convergence of two trails, yellow trail and the blue trail, which both converge again back at the mill. So about 500 meters back, 500 yards probably back. So again, south facing slope. The bedrock cap right up there is my old ATV trail. Goes along the top. So this is all south facing. And it's really dense right now. So this section right here, I think I'll probably do more than a 30 meter diameter cut. Probably do more like, probably double that. And maybe let some of it regenerate naturally. And another part I'm going to plant in clover and other food for the, especially for the deer and the grouse. The regeneration parts, like the sprouts that are going to come up from the aspen and the red maple that get cut, that's going to be moose fodder. So they will concentrate heavily in this spot as soon as I cut it. In fact, as soon as I start cutting, if it's this fall, the animals, deer, and especially the deer and the moose are going to congregate right here and start eating the tops of the trees as I drop them down to within grasp of them. Because obviously the succulent growth is mostly way up in the canopy and they can't access that. So by cutting it down, it'll put it at ground level where they can reach it. So that's going to create some food immediately. But as, like I said, the aspen and the red maple in particular sprout back up again, and the birch, then those moose are going to be feeding on those saplings and those twigs and everything immediately, and probably for the next 5 or 6 years before the canopy starts growing back in again. So on this edge of this clearing on the north side, so probably along this ridge behind me, I'm going to fill this with nut trees, I think, oak, different oak species, hickory, chestnut, hazelnut, and then I can create some barriers with the branches. I can also plant some fruit trees like apple trees, which I think maybe they may do okay back here. Let's see. And then some berries, so blueberries and raspberries and blackberries and stuff for all the wildlife. This is going to be interesting to see this area transform. So I'll show you the before and after at the cut, and then show you over the years how it progresses. An example of an oak that could use a little bit of help to free up the canopy, although it's not bad. It's actually higher than most of the other surrounding trees. But this section, yeah, see, this whole section is not dead. No, there's lots of leaves on it, but it's dying for sure. Like this. I don't know where the solid section of the inner bark is that's carrying all the nutrients up, but that's mostly hollow by the sounds of it, and that's all rotten on the outside. This is solid, and that one looks solid. The 3 main trunks, and one of them's dying, but it's all together, it's all one tree out of one root, so when that dies or continues to deteriorate, it's letting disease probably into that tree, letting water in, fungus and stuff, so it's kind of going to be on a decline. So what I could do is look around here. This is all balsams underneath because they're one of the species that's just able to proliferate here. Let's see, right there, huge oak putting on massive leaves trying to grow and gather some sunlight. So I cut the balsams down around that and let that get some sunlight. That'll start growing up. That will be the replacement tree for all of this when it dies. So I'm not sure if that's the biggest or best one, but for sure just take a look around. There's going to be lots of oak seedlings here that are just waiting for their opportunity. So if I can free them up, free up get some sunlight into this section, get some of the stuff cut back even so that the roots of this oak tree can get all the nutrients they need, or more than they're getting now. Maybe the tree can be healthy enough to survive for another 50 years, you know. There's a red squirrel. But this is a seed tree. This will be seeding all the oaks in this whole area, the whole section of the forest, because it's big and mass producing. I don't think it produced anything last year, but the previous year had a bumper crop. So I'll take a look around and see what other oak trees we can help in this section. It's been a really good year for seed production, actually, from the pines, especially for the pines, spruce, and balsam fir. There's a fresh green cone that came off one of the small trees. I guess it cut down or it dropped from above here. So all these seeds, of course, feed the wildlife. So that's why I'm not taking down any more trees than I need, or that that would not improve the forest, because all these seeds feed all the wildlife. And of course, that's the next generation of trees. Once there's a clearing, if there's not already little seedlings that have started, that are popped up, then those seeds will germinate once they get some sunlight and some moisture. But the challenge for me, of course, and for I guess most people, is to how to integrate into the ecosystem with doing minimal damage. We always have an impact, but every animal has an impact on the ecosystem. If you look at all those little maple saplings, and especially on my old property where the old cabin was, almost all of the saplings, once they got up to about this high, they were browsed off 100% by moose and deer, but mostly moose there. And even here, I documented 12 deer on this property that utilized this property throughout the year last year, and maybe 4 or 5 moose at least, and then 3 or 4 bear. So those animals are able to crop the next generation of trees off completely and stop them from growing. Or what they do is when they take off the leader, they eat the most succulent part, which is the growing tip. When they chew that off, the tree then starts creating new leaders or branching out, and it gets really irregular. That's why you see all these pines that were likely damaged by weevil when you get this fast growth in openings after that fire 100 years ago, but it also could have been from moose browsing the tops of those. So the leader keeps getting eaten off or killed off by the weevils. So the tree just keeps branching out. So you'll see a lot of these trees are like at about that level, branching out like this and then having multiple stems. That's not good for lumber, of course, or especially for future, like 50 to 100 years down the road, but also creates weak points. So these lateral branches are weaker than a strong main trunk. So when those large ungulates get out of control, the browsers, if the population of those get too high, which is not the case here, but in the States it often is, where deer populations are so high and so dense that they don't let any regeneration occur. So we have to have a balance. But my challenge, like I said, is to fit into this ecosystem, having the minimal impact, but maximum prosperity. So to thrive on the property. So like I mentioned, of the 100 acres here, 106 acres or whatever it is, plus the surrounding thousands of acres of public land that aren't getting managed or cut, I'm only impacting a small section. I'm only manipulating a small section for my use, for my family's use, and then manipulating a broader area for wildlife to improve the wildlife habitat, and also at the same time, through the forestry consultant, maximizing the productivity of the forest for lumber and firewood now and in the future. So it's multi-dimensional. I can't just focus on one aspect. It would be easy just to say, let's select for oak and pine the highest value lumber now and in the future. So cut everything else out, basically let the pine regenerate and the oak regenerate everywhere, and the existing trees grow in girth, maximize their value and cut them down over time. But that is not the best ecosystem for wildlife. You need more of a herbaceous layer, lower layer. And that requires sunlight, and that requires removing some of the canopy, enough of the canopy that the sunlight can get to the floor. The pines, less wildlife use these pines than other tree species. So if I was to cut a pine down, for example, and let things like hop hornbeam, hazelnut, even red maple sprouts, cherry, we've got lots of black cherry here, birch, the other food species. But anyway, if I let those generate instead, I'm going to have no lumber in the future, but really good wildlife habitat. So I'm trying to balance that. I've got 1/4 of an acre cleared here and 1/4 of an acre cleared on the other property for growing food. So that's orchard, some nut production, but mostly annual and perennial vegetables and fruit and vegetables. So that's probably enough to feed my family. It did a pretty good job last year providing enough calories in the form of mostly potatoes, sweet potatoes, beets and carrots, so mostly root crops. But this section I'm kind of regenerating this year because it's been going down in productivity really quickly just over the last 2 years because of the acidity and the lack of organic material in the soil. It's mostly sand. So I planted a whole bunch of nitrogen fixing small shrubs that I can chop and drop, so let grow up quickly, chop them off, and keep doing that so the nitrogen gets fixed into the soil but then dropped into the soil in the form of more carbon from the branches and the stems. So that's what's going on back there this year, as well as growing some vegetables, potatoes and stuff. So that's this zone that's close to the cabin. I've been clearing some of the underbrush here at the cabin as well. You can see back there, especially knocked a lot of this small stuff down, took out a lot of the small balsam firs and lower branches off of trees so that I get more airflow through here, which dries out the cabin, stops the logs from rotting or getting mildew or mold on them. And then the airflow comes through also and keeps the bugs down. In fact, there's some bugs that I'm swatting at right now, but they're actually pretty good already. It's only the second week of July. But now that I've got these more clearings, more sun kind of coming in, I've got to be careful that I don't have too many things regenerate and get really thick that I don't want. So I'll be adding in some bug repelling plants like absinthe and and maybe even mint if I can control that, thyme and things like that around the cabin, and then some fruit bushes and maybe some hazelnuts or something along this berm right here. So multi-dimensional, like I said. I have to manage for wildlife, for timber, for firewood, for food, and for habitation. Warm, eh? The other thing I'm doing in here is, well, I've got 150 sea buckthorn, which is not the invasive buckthorn you're probably thinking about. This is a sea berry. It fixes nitrogen, survives in really harsh northern climates like this, and it, like I said, fixes nitrogen, grows quickly enough that I can chop and drop to add carbon and nitrogen into the soil. Then I've got fruit bushes all around the outside and some shrubbier, thornier stuff like native rose, wild rose, and vines. I've got grapes growing up the perimeter on the fence. I've got hardy kiwi growing up along that fence on the north side of the sort of shaded section of the garden, and apple trees, pear tree, asparagus, cherry trees. We're going to be adding more of those over time, kind of throughout the garden, to keep them pruned small. So, but I need pollinators. This is not an ecosystem that has a lot of native flowers because a lot of it's dense forest. Now out at the edge of the meadow you get a lot of wild or native spirea, meadow sweet, and a few other fruiting type bushes that are providing a lot of flowers, but only at a certain time of the year. So I'm trying to create some diversity and spreading out the time available for pollinators, so they can come in and pollinate the crops and just benefit the ecosystem in general. Some more butterflies, bees, and so on, and then birds. Got bird houses all over the place. They didn't get occupied. I don't think a single one got occupied this year, but next year they'll start finding them and nesting in them, hopefully. But these things I keep talking about, the little shrubs that I planted 150 of, it's not just for nitrogen and carbon fixing in the soil. It actually is really healthy. It's a really healthy berry, but also the leaves for tea are really healthy. So anyway, that's what I've been up to. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you at the cabin next time. Take care.